is if everybody's back now at 6 o'clock. And the aim for this session is we really are going to discuss something interesting, but also that we stay alive till 7 o'clock. And what I promise is I will do the roundup. I will do it in less than 15 minutes. So really before 7 o'clock we will leave. But then I'm going to promise you a nice graphic, because we talk all the time about dynamics, and I will have a dynamics picture for you to look forward to. But before we do that, we do enforcement, because it has been extremely clear from the start, and I think Christian Lloyd was extremely clear on that. Standards are no use if there's no enforcement. And I've been for 10 years in the Ministry of Finance making regulations. And the only thing we always checked is you make the rules, how do you do the enforcement, and then you make a decision. So now we are with the regulators, which have a long-standing experience supervising security supervision, including the standards for information and how that is done. We have two very experienced speakers. We are really happy with that. The first one is Stephen Maijoor, Chair of ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authority. Before that, he was supervisor at the AFM, Authority for Financial Markets in the Netherlands. And before that, he was an academic, like many here in the European Corporate Governance Institute, professor of accounting in the real capital of Europe. And that's, of course, Maastricht, where the euro has been born. So that's where Stephen started all his work on auditing and accounting and standards. So it's a long experience. The second speaker this afternoon is Tajinder Singh, because I think Tajinder, you're really needed, because when Erky started this afternoon, he said, yeah, global standards, and then we need global enforcement. So IOSCO is really the partner in crime here. And you're representing IOSCO as Deputy Secretary General. And well, we talk a lot about Europe, we talk a lot about the US. We have once mentioned China and India. I'm also very happy that you come from one of these other jurisdictions so that we really get the global perspective, because we have to be careful not to be myopic in our own region. So I'm really forward to you have a long-standing history in India. You've been with the regulator. Before that, we were colleagues. You were at the Ministry of Finance in India. So that perspective, to bring that to the table is extremely important. And that's why I'm also glad that we had Christian from the US. That IFRS, what we're talking today is about international standards. Sandy from BlackRock, we have international investors, international companies, so we should really try to see what we can achieve with global standards and how we can move forward. So let me stop now and give the floor to Stephen for your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for that introduction. Thank you very much to you and the organizers for inviting me to speak here today. Very interesting that you refer also to my academic background, because indeed the discussion on non-financial reporting is already to some extent a very long debate, and also providing assurance on non-financial information has a long history, but clearly this area has got enormous traction because of the issues around sustainability. Maybe first on why this topic is important for ESMA, why this topic is important for securities regulators, both at the European level and at a global level. Obviously, we know that the allocation of capital is not only driven by financial performance, but also by non-financial performance, non-financial metrics. And so as it influences decision-making by investors, and it should influence decision-making by investors, it is squarely in our remit, and it's the reason why we need to think and need to have attention and work on the issues related to ESG, sustainability, non-financial reporting. The other reason, of course, is that there is an important angle, both in terms of, and this relates to the mandate of securities regulators, both in terms of investor protection and stability. And in that sense, we should not be naive. And of course, the ESG developments are a positive development, but wherever there is the information is relevant for capital allocation, there's also the risk of information not being, let's say, a proper reflection of the underlying economics, of the underlying situation. And there can also be opportunistic reasons to bias information. So in that sense, there are the well-known risks around greenwashing. And I think in that sense, the risk of misrepresentation in principle is not different from financial reporting. And added to that, of course, there is less experience, less developed standards, and that would even increase to the risk of not having a proper reflection of the underlying reality. Maybe very briefly on ESMA as the European Securities Regulator, we are heavily involved in sustainability issues, in ESG issues. So sustainability is part now of our founding regulations since the start of this year. We have issued at the beginning of this year a sustainability strategy, which we did in February. We're involved in standard setting for the disclosures, for example, for the financial sector, which is called the SFDR in the EU. So we're currently working on the disclosures for investment firms, asset managers, and we're doing that together with our fellow authorities in banking and insurance. And we also collect data on this part of the market. It is important that we understand what kind of products are sold, what are the characteristics of these products. So we have also started to invest in the collection of data on non-financial reporting issues. And obviously, we're also involved in IOSCO work. And currently, we're, for example, leading the work stream on sustainability ratings within IOSCO. Let me then go briefly to the core issues which are at the table. And so what I would like to very briefly comment on is why are international standards important here? Why is the IFRS Foundation a kind of a logical host for these international standards? And finally, a few quick reflections on the key features of such non-financial reporting standards. So first, going to this first question, why should we work on international standards in this area regarding ESG, regarding non-financial reporting? ESMA is a supporter of this development, a clear supporter, and we will also reflect that in our consultation reaction to the consultation by the IFRS Foundation. And I think a first clear argument for this international angle is that the underlying problem is addressed with global policies. The Paris Agreement, where there are 190 countries that have committed to the Paris Agreement, need to progress on the issue around sustainability, trying to limit the increase in global temperature. Obviously, that also requires a proper yardstick of how countries, and ultimately also companies are progressing towards the commitments made in the Paris agreements, and therefore an international yardstick is important. Secondly, there is the issue around stability. As you are very much aware, also there are concerns about the possible stability consequences of the global warming. There has been quite extensive work in terms of stress testing the financial system for the transition towards economies that are better responding to the development of global warming. For that kind of exercise, you need also standards, you need disclosures, and obviously their international standards would be very helpful. Finally, I think the key rationales that apply for having IFRS in financial reporting is obviously also relevant to non-financial reporting for ESG, is that the investor base is international, and therefore if you want to compare investment opportunities, companies across countries, it is important to have similar standards, the same standards, and also in terms of the cost for the issuers, for the preparers, it would be helpful to have the same standards. Of course, I'm talking here about let's say, getting to an end state, and obviously in the short to medium term, we can see that there are different speeds, and we need to take into account that some regions are further than other ones, and I will get to that point in a minute. Let me then secondly go to why I think that the IFRS Foundation is an appropriate body to work on the development of ESG standards, of sustainability standards. First of all, obviously, is that the IFRS Foundation has developed credibility with the IFRS standards, and that credibility is helpful to kickstart the work on ESG reporting, on ESG standard setting. Particularly, I would like to mention 3 areas. First of all, the experience with having a full-time standard setting board with a expert-driven approach towards standard setting. That is important to get credibility around the standards. Secondly, why it would be beneficial to have this to do this work within the IFRS Foundation. Of course, the connection between financial and non-financial information. We know that ultimately users, and it will depend on the type of user, is that they would like to use both financial and non-financial information for their decision making, and so having this in one place, or at least being coordinated in one place, would be beneficial. And third, what I would like to emphasize, one of the strengths I think I've always seen of the IFRS Foundation is the way they interact with their broad range of stakeholders. Getting standards right is not only a technical exercise, but also making sure that the due process is done properly. And in my view, the IFRS Foundation is one of the bodies that is probably the most experienced with on a global level to get these stakeholder interactions adequately arranged. Obviously, there has been a point, and I was able to listen in to the previous discussion, is that we can see that one of the benefits in the past, of course, of IFRS was that the standards were already much more developed. We're now in a situation where there's not a clear global standard already emerging. We have various initiatives, and I can also see and very much support the very strong progress at the European level and the fast progress that is currently achieved. And as an authority, we're contributing to that fast development in the EU. At the same time, I can well see a model where you would work on, let's say, a global basis of standards, and subsequently there would be a European top-up. And obviously you would expect that both the international level and the regional level would take each other's progress into account. Finally, what I should say on what I think the IFRS Foundation should be taking into account is obviously it will not build from scratch. There are already some standards, and I would expect that the IFRS Foundation would already take these first developments into account, like the ones of the TCFD. And also a point that was mentioned previously is that the stakeholder base needs to become broader. Currently, the IFRS Foundation obviously has limited interactions with NGOs, with civil society, and that would also mean is that the stakeholder base would need to be adjusted and need to be expanded. Finally, on some first thinking on, let's say, the elements of the standards themselves, I am very much in favor of the double materiality notion. And this is not only around the impact of the environment on a company, but it's also around the impact of the company on the environment. We know that that is now more and more taken into account by investors, by asset managers. And so double materiality, how complex it is, we need to start working on that. Also, I understand that the IFRS Foundation is focusing, let's say, on climate first, but obviously also the other parts are important. The social and governance aspects we have seen from our data, for example, that in 2020 there has been a strong growth of the issuance of social bonds. And finally, and this gets to the point around enforcement, we need to have standards that are enforceable. And on the one hand, you want to have standards that are reasonably principles-based. This is a developing area, and so they will inevitably not be as detailed as we're currently used to in financial reporting. But they need to be sufficiently granular to allow enforceability and auditability. So let me stop here, Dirk, and hand back over to you. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. What I really liked is at the start that you said, well, these standards are about global policy. And in that sense, there is really a link to international standards and international policies in these areas. Okay, straight over to Tajinder, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dirk, for this invitation. Let me start very quickly by introducing IOSCO's role here. IOSCO is the global standard setting body for securities regulation with over 115 members that are responsible for capital markets oversight. Our three objectives are pretty much the objectives of securities regulation, investor protection, fair, efficient, and transparent markets, and the reduction of systemic risks. So these are the three objectives that inform IOSCO and they inform securities regulators, who together, our members together regulate more than 95% of the world's capital markets. Now, relevant to the discussion today and the question about enforcement, our members regulate and enforce securities laws, including disclosure, and in many jurisdictions set the form and content of financial reporting. Of course, in IOSCO, what we want to do is to concentrate on global issues. This is one such global issue, and there we try and look for global solutions. Now, clearly, in addition to financial reporting, non-financial reporting is very important, as Stephen mentioned, and also one of the key areas that we care about is the avoidance of global market fragmentation. And therefore, this work that we're talking about is relevant to all the three objectives that I mentioned of securities regulation: investor protection, market efficiency and integrity, and the reduction of systemic risk. Now, given the context today in which we are talking about, and I do remember what Erkki said at the beginning in terms of going back 20 years and how the IFRS came into being, it would also be good to remember the role that IOSCO played in 2000 that set the foundation for the adoption of IFRS when we endorsed the IFRS for its use in cross-border offerings, as well as established the current three-tier governance structure that the IFRS Foundation has today, and the credibility that it therefore also enjoys, with also the monitoring board that IOSCO chairs, in which also other members are involved, including the European Commission. We very much welcome the IFRS consultation and the setting up of the SSB as an important milestone. And we will be replying from IOSCO, so it is something that is still under discussion. However, what I can say is that we are definitely looking to continue our intensive engagement with the IFRS in the efforts to establish a comprehensive global corporate reporting system that meets the needs of the global capital markets and serves the public interest. And we think that the IFRS proposals can promote consistency and comparability across borders and reduce the risk of fragmentation. We also think that robust standards that are interconnected with financial reporting standards would also support audit and assurance, and I know that came up earlier, and that would enhance the market's trust in sustainability disclosures and could lay the foundations for mandatory corporate reporting on sustainability internationally. And that, of course, connects again to the enforcement aspect, because with mandatory corporate reporting, that is where you get to enforcement. Now, let me get to what we are doing. I mentioned about what we think about the IFRS consultation proposals. So IOSCO itself has been engaged with this area, and we had issued a report in April of this year highlighting the proliferation of reporting standards, the voluntary and high-level nature, the lack of binding obligations, as well as other issues like greenwashing and ESG data and ratings. So we set up a board-level task force, the Sustainable Finance Task Force, with 3 work streams. The first on issuer disclosure, the corporate disclosure, second on asset managers and greenwashing, and the third on ESG data and ratings. And as Stephen just mentioned, ESMA is chairing this third work stream. And clearly, the aspect about issuer disclosure is cross-cutting across all the work streams. And our work has been informed by the strong global demand and growth of activities in this area. What we would like to see is a global system architecture that promotes comparability and consistency and reduces the risk of global market fragmentation. So what do we really care about from this in this area? We care about both content and governance. And what are we doing? On content, we are working with the Alliance of Standard Setters that have been talked about today on the provision of information that meets the needs of global capital markets and in a manner that can be integrated with financial reporting. And that approach is what is being referred to as the global building blocks approach that does contemplate jurisdictional add-ons, which was being discussed in the previous session, and to help with the cause of not fragmenting markets. A lot of what we are doing here is in the public domain, the statement of intent by the group of 5, the exchange of letters with IOSCO there. So that's what we are doing on the content side in terms of our engagement. On governance, very much interested and in the due process and the public interest element there. And clearly, the experience that we have had previously in the setting up of the IFRS, the 3-tier structure, the role in the monitoring board is important here. We are identifying also inside IOSCO the most decision useful categories of disclosures for market participants. We are using our convening power to help with the industry initiatives, talking to them, reducing almost the alphabet soup there and looking to see how we can achieve convergence there. And in governance, clearly in our role as chair of the monitoring board. We do support the requirements for success that are mentioned in the consultation paper, including public accountability and independence and rigorous due process. Indeed, the success so far of the IFRS, and let us not forget also the international standards on accounting, and we have been involved with all of these, and their success has been based indeed on these categories, on these characteristics that I just mentioned. We've been engaging with this, and as recently as about 2 weeks ago, we had a board meeting where this was pretty much the first item on the board. We had a very productive discussion and agreed we do need to think further about pathways to mandatory disclosures, and that does go to the enforcement question. Secondly, the engagement with the IFRS Foundation, and thirdly, how do we get to the assurance aspect of these things? So in conclusion, what I would say is that we do support the urgency and rapid progress here to deliver a comprehensive global corporate reporting system that meets the needs of capital markets and serves the public interest. And I'll be happy to engage in the discussion and answer any questions. But thank you, and back to you, Dirk.
Thank you, Tajinder, for a real nice overview and also really giving the global perspective and coming back to the issue that you had good experience with when the IFRS was started, that you were working closely together. And I have 2 questions, one from Christian I come to later, but one question from the audience which I want to echo myself. What are regulators doing to ensure that fund managers, individual and institutional, are competent and adequately trained in both evaluating sustainability information for investment decision making and holding corporate boards to account on sustainability issues? So that are the investors. And I would ask the same question because both of you didn't talk about it. How do you make sure that your people, the security supervisors, also are sufficiently on top of all these sustainability issues? So both for the investors and for the security supervisors.
Right. I don't know, Stephen, do you want to go first and I can supplement?
Yes, so Obviously, this is an important question because the issue around sustainability reporting, ESG reporting is not only about the disclosures themselves, but it's also how is it used. And so what we have done, for example, we have provided an advice to the Commission in this area on how to integrate sustainability factors both within asset managers and within investment firms. So part of the EU legislation is also to adjust the relevant governing rules, and in this case, this is using the well-known Euro speak. This is around MiFID and UCITS and AFMD, how they need to integrate sustainability issues into the governance, internal controls, risk assessments within those organizations. And so fully understand that this is not only around disclosure issues, but it's also around control issues. And for example, we have also given in the relevant guidelines, we have adjusted for investment advisors how they take sustainability elements into account when they are advising a product. So clearly, while we're talking here mainly today around disclosure issues, ultimately it goes beyond that, and how also to integrate those factors into other financial processes within the financial system. On the development of this area, well, I should say that over time we have been working on non-financial reporting not only since, let's say, 1 or 2 years. That is already with the non-financial reporting directive already being longer here and being applied. We have built up expertise in looking into these parts of financial statements, started to review already a number of years, the non-financial reporting part of financial statements. And I must say, looking at that, there is still, because I'm sure we have, understandably so, a positive approach today. But if you actually look at what is now reported and the quality of the information that is currently provided in the non-financial reporting area, it is clear that there is a long way to go, and there needs to be a clearly improvement in that part of the financial reports.
But can I challenge you, Stephen? Because thank you for being honest. Is it the knowledge, the skill set of the supervisors? Is it the difference in the type of the quality of the reporting? Where do you see the most scope for improvement?
Well, the fact the securities regulators are already for a longer time confronted with the issue with alternative performance measures, with non-financial information. I think that in itself, and the risk that is used opportunistically, and we have given guidelines, etc. I think that is not the biggest challenge. Where the biggest challenge is clearly the link with much more technical information on what is carbon footprint, how can you summarize that in a useful way, etc. So I think it is securities regulators, users of financial reports have already been confronted for a long time with non-financial information, with other there's been already a longer time also to not look only at financial metrics. I think that is not the new element. I think what is the new element is the link clearly with sustainability issues, with global warming type of issues. That brings also a certain technical component which is very new to us, and basically I think many people are struggling with that. And also the reliability of data there is a big issue. We should realize, we talk now very much around, let's say, the end process, what will come in the financial statements, but obviously what also needs to change, financial statements on the financial reporting side are built on a very lengthy accounting system, very detailed internal controls. And of course, that is a thing that also needs to develop in companies, in organizations themselves. How do you get all this reliable information finally into the financial statements? And so it is not only a disclosure issue at the end of the process, but it's also a whole administrative issue within organizations themselves.
Yeah, I recognize that my colleague at Erasmus University, Karen Maas, works on impact assessments and say, there are great mission statements and what companies want to achieve. They make big statements about what they say they do, an in-between. And then there are the management information systems, the business models, where a lot is lacking. So I recognize your issue. Tajinder, what would you like to add from your perspective?
No, I think precisely the point about, with regard to disclosure, representation, misrepresentation, as Stephen mentioned, that is not necessarily a new issue for us. There, I think what is new is of course the elements that are specific to ES and G, and we completely also understand that disclosure is not the only solution, which is why, as I mentioned, we have set up the other two work streams with regard to asset managers and greenwashing, as well as CRA ratings and so on. And I think the other thing here is probably also, because we're talking global, is the need for capacity building among regulators. And we do that. This is, of course, a new area where policy is still developing, and it will become part of the capacity building. And maybe just one additional point that I can make here is that this is something that has been also, it has come up in our Growth and Emerging Markets Committee as well, because a large number of emerging markets feel very strongly about this. It is also coming in as from the policy side of things. And we actually issued a report last year from the emerging market side, where we have talked about the need for asset managers and so on to be able to integrate these into their risk assessments and so on. And we basically asked those regulators to incorporate all of these into regulation.
Thank you. Then I would like to go to Christian, who has a question.
Yeah, so I actually have sort of maybe two, one for Steven and one for Tajinder. The question for Steven is, I mean, isn't perhaps, and I think you alluded to this in your last answer, isn't there sort of strong demand for investors, which the IFRS Foundation is pointing to, and the growing sort of a growing recognition that financial materiality, when it comes to ESG factors, is maybe not working so well? And so is it perhaps that firms are sort of, we're recognizing that firms are not measuring all the things that are financially material, that investors don't always know what's financially material and can't pressure the firms to provide this information. And so I wonder whether the quickest step, since time is of the essence, wouldn't be to say, we're going to go forward much more strongly on the enforcement side on clarifying what financial materiality means, how broad it can be, that it does include the ESG factors. I mean, the non-financial reporting directive that you mentioned already kind of clarifies that, but to do the same thing on the enforcement side. And you could do this, separately and on top of what the IFRS Foundation is doing. And then for Tajinder, I think my question is, what could exchanges do to help with the same problem? And so in particular, what I'm wondering is, many parts of the developing world to which you pointed, not all companies can go maybe as far as some of the European companies either can or want to go, or required to go because of EU regulation. But there are lots of companies that do. There are global players that want to play at the same level playing field that everybody else. So couldn't exchanges say, we're going to have premium segments, and for these premium segments, here are the rules and here are the standards by which you have to comply. This is the assurance regime that you need to have around it. And would that not be a very fast way to go forward? Thank you.
Steven, please.
So, I've read Christian's articles very well, and he's really convinced me around how important enforcement is. And just to go, Christian will like our strategy documents, where we say that probably we should put more effort into supervision and enforcement than in new policy making. I think typically we get very excited about rulemaking, and then once the rule is there, we don't care too much about how it's. I said it with a bit big words, but I'm a supporter of we need to look into supervision and we need to look into enforcement. So I'm completely convinced in that. The problem is in non-financial reporting in ESG, we have not an agreed set of standards. We don't have it. And of course, there are different sets are available, but we don't have yet a sufficient, you need to have a reasonable common standard around how to report on social factor, governance factors, environmental factors that is still not at all comparable to what we have in the financial reporting era. So I'm not in the camp to say, let's get to the finest detail in this, and then we'll focus on supervision and enforcement. We have already said as an authority that we should also preferably now move to bringing the non-financial reporting side under audit and going that direction. But I think it's fair to say that the standard setting itself is not at all comparable to what we now have in financial reporting. And it will be quite a task and a challenge to get that, to develop that, and to get to a set of standards that is accepted, broadly accepted, useful, and therefore that needs to happen. So I take the point on the need for credible supervision and enforcement, but I think we need to equally go in parallel with developing the standards. I don't think there's yet the level of standards available that in any way comparable to what we have in the financial reporting area.
It looks this old law of physics, communicating vessels. You need both vessels to get it working. The second question was for you, Tajinder.
Right. No, I also agree with the sentiment, Christian, in terms of what is behind your question. Actually, to both of us, is what can we get off the ground without necessarily getting into rule making. So completely get the point and appreciate it. And I think it is actually happening in terms of exchanges in many countries, especially in many emerging markets that do have segments. That have green segments or whatever, and that is something that is indeed that does encourage companies to do that. That does encourage what we're wanting to do. So absolutely, I think it can help. Question is whether it is sufficient and how far does it actually go? Because I think the element there is also about if you're talking about disclosures, then the type of disclosures that we are asking for in this area may not be, may be quite different. And that's the debate that we are currently having inside IOSCO. For instance, the whole aspect about forward-looking disclosure. And that is not something that securities regulators have traditionally dealt with. But, some of these components on ESG do take you to forward-looking disclosure. And also in terms of the exchanges, listing all of these, companies and bonds. At the end of the day, they these are governed by listing agreements, but these are also part of listing rules that are made in jurisdictions. So to some extent, you do get back into rules, and then and so the question still pops up about how do you put these into rules with regard to disclosures that may not be following the traditional model of disclosures, but has a little bit of a different paradigm there. So yes, I think it can help. It is helping, but is probably not sufficient.
Okay, we're coming to the end, but I have two final questions because both of you said quite loosely, okay, we are quite used to misrepresentation risk. We know how to do it. But Samit Trabelsi asked, how do you do it specifically? How can you curb misrepresentation risk of sustainability financial reporting? That's question number one. Question number two is from my good colleague Marleen Jansen-Groesbeek. And she says what is quite close to what I said before, reporting and reporting standards are the end product. But we need to do sustainability bookkeeping. For example, if you get your invoice from energy in, you need to make the link, what amount of emissions, carbon emissions does that mean? So financials should be more involved in sustainability accounting, carbon accounting, natural capital accounting, and so on. So what is your opinion on that issue? So two questions for both of you.
Again, I'm happy to have Stephen go first.
You go first this time, Tajinder.
Fine, that's fine. So I think on the first, no problem. I think on the first one, yes, we did talk about the misrepresentation and what is it that we do. I mean, in many ways, it is not very difficult, because if you have rules for disclosure and you are finding that that there is misrepresentation happening, then it is basically an offense under securities laws in most places, for which both civil and criminal action can be taken in many jurisdictions. And that is what really happens. That happens through enforcement, that happens also through investigation, and finally through to enforcement. So in that sense, it is something that is almost bread and butter of what securities regulators do on that side of things. Maybe just on the second point, I would say that it is probably something that will come down the line. I think we are still at relatively early stages there. And it does go a little bit to this point about the impact of companies, for instance, on the environment. And that is really this whole thing about single versus double materiality, where I think the point that has been made so far is that they are not as separate silos as we think. They are more interconnected than we think. And once that bridge is built into financial materiality there, then you go back to the same point about how to incorporate them into financial statements. So that would be basically my answers to both of the questions.
Okay, thank you.
Very briefly from my side, so I think it was the question from Mrs. Groesbeek. I think I already reflected in my earlier comments that I fully agree with that comment. Ultimately, this is not only around, let's say, an add-on at the end of the reporting process, but it's really also around making sure that you have the right internal administrative procedures in place. And I think that is something that is still lacking in organizations. You would, if you want to have reliable carbon footprint reporting, you need to have detailed information on, the way a staff travels, the impact of your machinery, the impact of buildings, etc. And so you need to have quite some administrative processing in place that are behind these type of disclosures. And probably this is one of the easiest areas, but then go to social and governance areas, it might even get more complex. And so I agree, this is related to also internal administrative processes. Regarding financials themselves, I would say that financials are probably the biggest user of this type of information coming from corporates, although they need to collect this information also for themselves. I guess for financials, it will be less complex. They are not the biggest, let's say, the polluters. But for them, it's important to get this information. For example, if you are an asset manager, you rely ultimately on the disclosures by the investees which are in your portfolio, and so you rely there on the publicly disclosed information by the investees. What it emphasizes the importance of having also alignment between the non-financial and the financial sector in terms of the type of things that they need to report on. And finally, on the enforcement issue, I must say I am concerned in the sense that I sometimes compare it. It has taken us decades to get the financial reporting in a good shape. Now we are confronted with a situation where in a very few years, because not much time there's not much time to lose here, because we can see how pressing the sustainability issue is. But we need to get this right in terms of metrics, in terms of enforcement, in terms of supervision. And so there is indeed a risk in this process of not getting it right. And we need to have the right balance between, on the one hand, we cannot take as much time as we have taken for the financial reporting side. On the other hand, getting it right is really a challenge.
Okay, I think on these words, we will close. Although you put a bit of caution in, Stephen, I think the good news is that both of you are saying, if you deliver clear standards, and that means harmonized standards, and which are very clear, then you are trained and your colleagues are trained to do the job. You are working already for a while on sustainability issues, and you are up to the job to look at enforcement. It will be challenging, but at least if we get good standards, you will play your part in supervising it. And I think that is extremely important. So thank you both of you for speaking in this panel and for all the questions. Now I'm going to finish, and I will be short because I'm between between, I'm hindering you to the drinks. So let me first make one point of my background. Some of you may have recognized it. It is a link to the last speaker, Tajinder. So it's from India, you see the Himalaya. But also, because of the COVID, there has been less emissions, less air pollution. That's why it is visible. So to connect to today's topic, I really hope that the IFRS can help out by keeping this picture. So whenever we see the clouds coming again, I hope IFRS and everybody else today in the webinar will speed up its efforts. So that's in the end why we are doing it. I promised you a nice graph. And you know, it is nowadays the way, if you have a conference, you have somebody sitting in the corner, scribbling, making pictures, what is discussed. And I learned two new words today, dynamic materiality and dynamic convergence. And these words come from transition dynamics. My good colleague Dirk at Erasmus University had a transition to a sustainable economy. And in the end, that's why we are sitting in the webinar today. Is a dynamic process, which is not fully predictable. And he has made a nice graph, which I'm going to share with you. And yeah. Can you, oh, sorry. Yeah, can you all see it?
Yes.
Yeah. So what this picture is doing, at the bottom, oh sorry, at the top, at the left, you have the incumbents. So that's the big thing today, but that's declining. And at the bottom, you have the new guys coming in. That's what we call niches. So at the top are the big guys, at the current paradigm. At the bottom, the new one. So we have financial reporting with investor focus. Now we get these niches, all the babies from Bob, GRI, SASB, IRC, sustainability reporting with the society focus. And in the middle, that's where the dynamics are. And we don't know exactly what comes out. So this is like what Bob is doing. This concept of transition dynamics is also from sociology. So something will happen, we don't know. And the trick is to try to envisage the end game. And that is at the top on the right, where you see the integrated reporting. So not financial and sustainability, but really integrated. And because the future is not known, I just call it a broad focus. And how we define that dynamically, that's up to Erki and Lucretia in the IFRS. So they are overseeing that process. And at the bottom, what is quite clear, just looking at the financial numbers with a narrow focus, that will be something of the past. And to link it to today's discussion, this picture, I think Erki was extremely clear with the opening, the case for global standards, complementing the work of others. And he stressed the need for a gradualist approach. And I think Stephen at the end mentioned the same. We need speed, but we need to also do it careful that we don't have too many accidents across the road, across the journey. On the academic session, what I really liked was that Christian pointed out this issue of coal. Do we have this investor focus coal, or do we have this, although we don't want to admit it, this broader sustainability goal? I think he was quite clear on it. And also, once you get into this game, and if you are honest, in the end, you talk about it. And I think for me, one conclusion is that single and double materiality is an analytical dividing line, which in practice will be dynamic. And I think that's for me one of the main lessons. Adrian said quite clearly, with the end picture in mind, we need to be holistic where we want to go. And then we get there step by step. And his examples of Alliander and ABN AMRO shows that it is possible to make these impact type statements. So it is not an issue of the future. Some companies are already doing it today. Now I'm getting to the panels. No surprise that Sandy Bos made a very clear and convincing case. Global companies, global investors, yes, please give us global standards, and also a nested approach so that at the global level, what is happening at regional levels, if that's all aligned, then we can go at different speed, but we get to the same end goal. And now I come to Bob, and I have a special slide for him. So I put all his offspring at the bottom, and I think he was quite clear on it. These offsprings, you need the niches to develop the new ideas, and I think all of them have done great work. I put impact-weighted accounts of George Serafeim at Harvard in also there, and what we are doing together with Adrian at the Impact Economy Foundation, where they have made these impact statements like for ABN AMRO. All these experience will help the IFRS in the Sustainability Standards Board. And I was really happy that Lucretia, Erki, and all the others are keen to build the Security Standards Board, not from scratch, but to build on what's there. And I think these niches are really have done a lot and have put pressure on the process. So they are extremely helpful, and that's exactly what we have in this transition dynamics. Then, so we have these niches coming up, moving up, and you can have two times of conversion. Either we are extremely successful, IFRS adopts it, and then we move quite quickly to the top, or they don't succeed, phase out, and then these new initiatives emerge. I think today's conclusion is that all the speakers are keen for this to succeed and to work together. So IFRS and the bodies at the bottom can work together. Then we had the discussion on Europe, where we have with the Sustainable Action Plan of the European Commission, with the European Green Deal, we are going very far. Happy to see that Biden might made his Green Deal, and China has also put it in the new 5-year plan. So things are moving forward, and then like the associations at the bottom, also what is happening in Europe, these initiatives which are a bit quicker, we can learn from, and then we come together at the end goal, and then what the supervisors were just saying in the last session, if the standards are clear, then we are more than happy in real time, so straight away, to deliver supervision, so that we really can get to integrated markets with integrated data, and then really on these data, investors, but also other stakeholders can then act, and will bring closer. So we not only act on financial, but also on sustainability reporting. So hopefully this picture is not confusing you, but putting things together. So the end aim is integrated reporting with a broad focus. And together with Lucretia, I would ask all of you, please, the questions are out in the consultation. So please join in writing in with your replies. I want to thank, first of all, Lucretia for reaching out to set this up together with Marco, because I think it is important that academics beyond the small circle get engaged in this issue. So thank you also for Christian, that we now really bring the academic community into this extremely important field where practice and academia can work together. And in addition, Hélène and Jonne Veldhuis, thank you for the practical support, because everything went very smooth. We even managed to share our slides to answer some of the questions. And then my final thing is, thank you for the participants. Nice of you coming in, Hélène. Thank you to all participants for your good questions. And finally, the speakers, I really enjoyed. I learned quite a bit of new things. I hope all of you. And then I wish you good drinks for the Friday evening, and hopefully see you on one of the next events on sustainability reporting. Thanks a lot to everybody.